Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Turnitin. Today, we're going to be exploring team-based learning and the case for student feedback on teaching and interdisciplinary learning. With me in the house today to explore this topic is Dr. Sophia Tan, who is the Senior Assistant Director, Center for Teaching, Learning and Pedagogy, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Hello, Dr. Sophia.
Hello, nice to be here on your show.
Lovely to have you. Just before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about your background and professional experience and what excites you about the work you do at Nanyang Technological University?
At NTU, I am currently a faculty developer. So, what I do is I support the teaching and learning at NTU. I work with faculty. We run a program at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Pedagogy that is catered to early career faculty. So, it's a foundations of university learning and teaching program. We help them to gain some basic foundational knowledge about teaching and learning at NTU, and also support their P&T, right? That's among other things that we do. So that's what I'm doing right now. Now, my background is more actually very boring. It's all related to education. I've been in education all my life, and I started in K-12. Then I became a professor in education before moving into faculty development in 2010. Yeah. So I've been in faculty development for a while. Recently moved back from the States to Singapore. And this is my first job in Singapore, NTU.
Quite an exciting background. I wouldn't say that's boring, but I guess it's just you've done it all in education, so it feels like it's boring. But I think it's quite an exciting background. Today we're exploring team-based learning, and we're going to be exploring talking from the angle of Larry Mickelson's team-based learning approach. So, from a pedagogical point of view, how do you describe team-based learning, and how can we foster this in institutions of higher learning?
So team-based learning is a very specific kind of application of collaborative small group learning in the classroom. Okay. It was popularized and developed by Larry Mickelson. And it has a very very specific structure, such that if you follow that structure, it would take care of a number of issues that faculty are typically concerned about in the classroom. So, for instance, how do we manage large classes and still have collaborative learning going on effectively, or high quality collaborative learning going on in a large class? So, we're talking about large classes that may be 100 to 200 students, okay, which typically you would think, oh, I would have to do nothing but lecture, right? So this particular approach um, addresses those issues so that students can be active and engaged during classroom time. Okay, so it's kind of a flipped approach, right? Where students are prepare for the class before they come, and during class, what they have these small group discussions, and they try to get the students to think more deeply and go to higher level thinking within the classroom, rather than in a traditional classroom where lectures take place within the classroom and students are passive learners, and then students go into more application and higher order thinking outside the classroom. So this kind of flips that. So if you're interested, if you have a large class and you're interested in um, getting students engaged, getting students to teach one another in peer instruction, then this might be something that you would consider.
So, in this context of a team-based, and you've just rightfully explained it as being a slight approach to collaborative learning, one would think that there will be need for feedback. We need to be able to offer feedback to students while they're in those smaller groups, even learning as a large class. Now, how do you describe effective feedback in this space, and how might we begin to consider utilizing feedback in the process of making student assessments work for learning?
If you know TBL, team-based learning, I'll call it TBL for short, you would know that feedback is something that is factored or designed into the process of TBL. Okay. So the first thing is students prepare outside the class, right? When they come in, the first thing they have in the class is an individual readiness assessment test. okay, which is kind of a quiz, right, with set of questions. Typically at this point, it is multiple choice questions. It sort of gets them to become accountable for their own learning before they come. Now, then they break, within their group, right? They tackle the same questions as a group. And at that point, they also receive immediate feedback on their learning. So at that point, the feedback that they get would be, did they get it right or not? Here's another chance for you to attempt the same question and see if you get it right. Okay. Now, after that, the feedback that they get would be the instructor going over or taking a look at how the class is doing at that point and sort of focusing or identifying some weak areas and attending to those weak areas in the form of feedback, right? And then it moves into the application exercises, which are higher level type of problem solving. And also, again, the lecturer or the facilitator of TBL keep would then monitor student learning and take note of strong weak areas and give feedback in that sense. Okay. Now, feedback is also given, I suppose, within the group itself when students teach one another, right? So they would get some amount of feedback when they attempt questions and they hear what their peers say about their responses. Because of the nature of the feedback, in that it is immediate, they will immediately know on the spot whether they got a question right or wrong. And they will also know who are the people in the team who actually are knowledgeable about that particular topic, right? Now, these will give them information about who they can, who actually is knowledgeable. Will give them information about who they can trust, I suppose, to answer that question correctly. So that's another form of feedback about that would give them information about group processes.
It does sound like there are so many layers of and opportunities for feedback in and a team-based learning structure, which
Right.
I would also assume that the level or the quality of feedback would need, or as an educator, someone who need to be aware of ensuring that there's quality in their feedback. So for academics, educators who are going to be involving themselves in team-based learning, what would you suggest as maybe a criteria to actually test the level of quality of their feedback they're offering?
Okay, I really think that that is a challenge of TBL, in that students sometimes, because they feel that the feedback is given to the entire team, that they individually may not be as aware of their own progress. Okay, so and I think that this is not really a challenge that's unique to the TBL situation. It is a challenge that is kind of encountered in large classes, where the
Mm,
faculty feels that there is no, there's a limited time and resource to provide individual quality feedback to every single student. And the students feel that the feedback that they receive as a whole, as a bundle, right,
mm,
doesn't really address the individual needs. Okay. So I would say have regular sort of feedback from students throughout the semester to know what are some issues that they still have about the areas, um, and try to address them along the way before the end of the semester.
yeah.
um, the other the other issue with TBL might be that it is very fast paced, right? When they come, they have a topic, and usually the instructor doesn't go back. Okay,
Mm.
it doesn't go backwards. They keep moving on to a new topic, so it can feel very very intense and very fast paced. So I think it's good to pocket in some time for students to do some reflection along the way. Okay, and I think this is something that some TBL facilitators or instructors have tried to incorporate into the process.
You've just mentioned it's quite challenging to I'm just reframing what you said. It might be quite challenging to personalize feedback to students because in this case you're giving a collective feedback, so everyone would think, oh, this is a group feedback. And there also the challenge of it being a fast working in a very fast pace where it's very doesn't give enough time for people to reflect. and you're advising educators to provide or embed that opportunity for reflection. What other challenges exist in a team-based learning environment that we should be aware of?
Obviously, I think one of the challenges would be the group dynamics and group issues, because this is very focused on small group learning. So we have, by small groups, I mean 5 to 7 students within a group, right? So a number of things can happen because you are in the same team throughout the entire semester. And in some schools, you're in the same team for the entire year. Okay, so you really have to be able to work with your team. That's a huge challenge. Now, even though TBL has structured into the process um, some level of taking care of the group processes. So, for instance, what I referred to a point that I made earlier about you getting immediate feedback, and that feedback tells you who in your group is an expert on which topics, right?
Mm.
So that gives you some information about, well, even though this particular student is quiet, maybe I should have, I should draw my peer out a little bit more. I should listen to them rather than listen to someone who is very talkative and maybe gets them wrong all the time. So such information actually helps with the group processes. However, it doesn't take care of all the problems. So what we do usually is to give them an orientation before the TBL so that they know what they're going in for. They are prepared. They meet their team. They work out. They do some team building um, before they even get into the team-based learning classroom. And throughout the semester, perhaps during the halfway point, we encourage them to do peer feedback or peer evaluation. So everyone in the team would receive some feedback from their peers as to how they have been doing as a team member.
So if we're moving, and I think that's a really very pertinent point you make there, the need for supporting the students and building rapport before actually getting into that environment. I can only imagine, we're just going to move the lens a little bit. I can only imagine in an interdisciplinary learning environment, the challenges will even be magnified because people will be coming in from different disciplines and they're trying to work together. So they might have learned a specific way of doing things in one discipline, and now you're bringing different disciplines into one learning environment. In an interdisciplinary learning environment, how can we effectively use feedback to drive student learning?
Okay, so let's talk about interdisciplinary learning first. I would like to think of interdisciplinary learning as not just bringing in students from different backgrounds, but as an environment where they can tackle issues that cut across different disciplines that cannot be sort of addressed within a single discipline, right? That is really the value of interdisciplinary learning. So if the focus is on trying to solve problems that are larger than one discipline, then it makes sense to put students of diverse backgrounds together because that's actually going to help, right? And the feedback has to be focused on the connections that students make across the different disciplines, if that's what we value, right? Rather than focusing on how much knowledge they have gained in different disciplines, the feedback has to be more focused on the synthesis or the creation of new knowledge in that cuts across different disciplines. And so I would say this is a challenge because generally, when we consider giving feedback in such situations, it is best, I feel, done as a dialogue so that you can provoke students to think more deeply by asking questions. So, a dialogue meaning that, it's a conversation that you can have with your students, or that you can get students or you can teach students to have that dialogue among themselves. So they can have the conversation. And that conversation has to be maybe driven by questions. The conversation has to be, perhaps there's a question you could ask your students to further their thinking and help them see the connection. Perhaps it's a question that they ask. So they have to learn to ask questions too of one another. Of course, the other challenge is, like you said, because they're from different disciplines, they have different ways of thinking about things. And of course, they may run into problems of maybe just jargon. Maybe it's just jargon in my field that they cannot understand. So these are things that they have to work out as well. So I would say that it's important to give them some amount of scaffolding that could help them to overcome these problems.
Very interesting there, and I think you just also put shed the light on the need for more dialogic feedback, because that's what we're seeing. It seems to be growing in the educational sphere. But the question is, how much time do we have to do that? Well, I think
Exactly.
it's a really good thing. Now, talking about feedback, there's a need for using rubrics to support how we give feedback, because rubrics makes it more explicit. You can actually point out what the student has done and why they got a specific mark. Would you say, or how, as a feedback strategy, what are some best practices for designing rubrics in assessments, especially for team-based learning?
Let me just talk about rubrics in general. I think it it applies to TBL as well. The first thing about designing rubrics is that it should be aligned to the learning outcomes. So we need to look at our learning outcomes, go back to the learning outcomes, right? If you have developed them carefully, and they focus on like important concepts within your discipline, significant issues, then going back to the learning outcomes would be the first step.
Hmm.
Look at the learning outcome and think about the highest level of achievement students can have with that learning outcome. Okay, what is the highest level of achievement? That's one of the advice I often give. Think about the highest level and then try to articulate what that is. Okay, then think about breaking that down into graduated levels so that students of diverse backgrounds, right, can sort of set their own goals and use that as a guide to sort of move up, right, or to reach their own goals. And the reason that I said, think about the highest level first is so that we don't limit our students, right? Um, it doesn't become a ceiling for our students. At the highest level, students should be able to go as far as they can. Okay, and we should be able to capture that in the rubrics. The second thing is I would probably say pay attention to the quality of assessment of your students' responses in addition to quantity, because I think it's very easy to write up rubrics based on quantity, right? How many citations did I use? But instead focus on things like, did I use my citations to support my arguments? How well did I do that? So there's a difference between quantity and quality. And we want to take, if you want to take both into considerations, but don't forget about the quality.
Mhm.
I think it's easy to let that go. The last thing I would say is involve your students in the creation of your or the refinement of your criteria of your rubrics. Use them as partners. Ask them to give some feedback, because very often students are the ones that use them, right? And they will know the pitfalls, or they would be able to give you some feedback as to which part's not clear, and so on. So I would definitely say refine your rubrics as you go along with it.
Very, very important point there. I think one of the biggest takeaway, and I think it's the first time I'm actually hearing this, is a rubric being that tool students can use to goal set. So I thought that was a really, really good nugget there. I also do appreciate that you've also called out the need to co-create the rubrics with the students, that level of co-design, and which involves uh, them assisting with refining. With regards to using dialogic feedback in a team-based learning environment, I know it's a bit of would I say conundrum, or would I say a difficult thing to do, because it's a team-based learning environment. You're trying to engage students in a dialogue to give them feedback. The biggest challenge there would be, do we have enough time to do that in the classroom? So what are your tips from experience that educators can begin to do to embed a little bit of dialogic feedback in their assessments?
That's a very, very difficult thing to do. I would
No,
say
that-
for I would say even for an experienced instructor, dialogic teaching And dialogic feedback is something that's very, very challenging to do because it requires you to make a lot of decisions on the spot, right? Because you're having this real time conversation. It requires you to sort of humble yourself down because you're opening yourself up to a lot of questions from your students too, which you may not know the answer to. Let me go back to maybe describe dialogic feedback a little bit more. It's a conversation, but really the value of dialogic feedback is that in the in that students are actively engaged, right, in the feedback process. Okay, and that is a very valuable thing because very often we find that students are kind of passive receivers of feedback. Okay, so one way, and I give students feedback, I tell you how you're doing, um, and the students are just passively receiving it, right? And we know that passive learning doesn't work, right? So even in the feedback process, we want students to be active and to take ownership of that process. So we need to teach them how they can do that. Okay, and through modeling and all that, and through establishing a culture in the classroom where dialogues are accepted and valued. Now, the challenge, of course, is what you said, that this time. How do we do that? It is very tricky. You have to make some decisions on whether you sometimes want to pursue a strand, right, of thought, or you want to hold it back, or you want to rein in the discussion, and you want to continue with what you have planned. Because these are things that happen in dialogic teaching and dialogic feedback. So I would say the first thing is you need to be very, very familiar with the how the discussion may go. And of course it's hard to be familiar with it because if you have never done it before, but as you gain experience you will start to realize that there are some issues that may arise, and you will start to kind of capture these, and you will start to sort of know that these will arise at what points. And when you are aware of that, you can slowly build that into the curriculum so that there is sufficient time to address those things and issues as they come. And of course, the if you have to move on because you decide, based on your professional judgment, this is really not a topic we should address right now, then by all means move on and explain to your students why you're moving on and leaving that behind, or maybe do we come back to it at a different point, right? So it's highly flexible, and it requires you to listen very actively to students learning and to students needs, and to respond on the spot. I'd say it's very challenging,
It
indeed.
is. I can see how challenging it can be. And the reason I'm asking the question is not to put you on the spot, but just so we can get to a sense where you've actually pointed out one of the most important things. You've got to plan for it. You've got to plan for it to know. And once you know the content and know where the conversations in the class is going to go, you give yourself enough time, and it just makes it seamless. Yes, there will be at times where things go out of sync, but it's part of the conversation. How do we bring that level of conversation or that dialogue in the class in a way that students know that they're seen, they're heard, and what they're doing has an impact? We're gonna quickly do a wrap, and my final question would just be around how do we begin to think about assessments for team-based learning? So, what are your suggestions for strategies to make assessments work for team-based learning environments?
So for those who are new to team-based learning, it is actually a very, very structured approach. So if you follow the structure of team-based learning, pretty much the feedback takes care of itself within a large class. Okay, so you have students come in, you have the individual readiness assessment test, the team readiness assessment test, and within those, feedback is structured into the quizzes or the multiple choice questions. Then it comes to when you have to step in and facilitate the learning, and that's when you sort of want to take a look around and see, what are the weak areas, identify those and address those, right? So going back to the point that if you follow the structure of team-based learning, pretty much the feedback actually takes care of itself. Now, TBL also has a number of strategies for you to apply to your assessment questions. that will help students to reach higher level thinking. Okay, and one of them is called specific choice, which I personally love, because if you have no choice but to do multiple choice questions, then think about applying specific choice. So, specific choice refers to setting up your question so that it requires students to make a choice, okay, which is the best choice they can make. So, rather than phrasing your assessment task in terms of what's right and what's wrong, there's no clearly wrong response, right? And every choice is plausible, but there is one best choice. Okay. So, for instance, if I say, can you identify a sentence in this passage that uses passive voice? Okay, that is pretty much you end up with right or wrong. Okay. Now, but if I ask you to identify a best use of passive voice in this text, I'm asking you to make a very specific choice. And this specific choice is something you have to defend. Okay. And in trying to defend your choice, you're actually getting your students to actually reach higher levels of thinking. Okay. So in most medical schools, they have the questions in terms of maybe this is a diagnostic question. It give you a case, how would you diagnose this? And there could be multiple different correct answers to this. But what is the choice you would make in this case? Okay, so um, and there are many gems like this in TVL. Okay, specific choice is one of them. So I would really encourage you to, if you're interested in this, to read up more about this.
Yeah, I'm very very excited to speak to you today about team-based learning. I think it's still a, I would say, a slightly untapped resource in the educational sector, and I was very excited to see that you do have experience. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. Sophia Tan, who is the Senior Assistant Director, Center for Teaching, Learning, and Pedagogy, for our insights on team-based learning and the case for student feedback on teaching and interdisciplinary learning. Thank you so much today.
Thank you, Chooks.